in a Catholic seminary here, it transformed my faith life too. It really has enriched my perspective and deepened my understanding of our Lord. And I want to share later today when we talk about Laudato Si and Pope Francis and creation, where I think there can be so many bridges that can be drawn between Syriac theology and contemporary Western Roman Catholic theology through this topic of creation and ecology. But that's going to be later. So as I say, it's just really exciting for me to be here. And as someone who teaches undergrads for the most part, who are wonderful, they don't always necessarily want to hear from me, you know. So if you've taught in 8 a.m. Theology 101s, it's really nice to see these attentive faces here. And so I'm grateful for your energy and your audience here today. I was asked before I get going with the presentation to say a few words about Syriaca.org. Syriaca.org was started, this is a digital humanities, a portal for the study of Syriac, all things Syriac. So there's different, we call them modules. It was started by my friend and colleague, David Michelson, who teaches at Vanderbilt University, and Daniel Schwartz and Thomas Carlson. We were on the original team that put this project together. And the idea was to have a reference portal to bring different components of Syriac studies together in one place so that people could have access to the geography of the Syriac world. And so that's found in this portal. Can I just touch this? I think that will go up. We'll see if this works. Inevitably, there will be a revolt. It's not going to work. You're not going to work, are you? Is it coming up? Well, I don't know.
Click like.
Maybe this will come. See if this works. Oh yeah, here we go. So the Gazetteer is a portal of Syriac places. And so you can see here the city of Edessa, Center for Syriac Culture in the Ancient World, is our feature place. So just briefly so you can see how this works. We have the name of the city here in all of its different forms and varieties, all the different ways that Edessa is known, as well as where it sits, and different descriptions of Edessa, and so on and so forth. And then down here, we have also in the sea, also you can click and find and see how this place is visualized in other different digital sources. So you can see, for instance, perhaps we'll just click on Pleiades. This is kind of interesting. Pleiades is a digital project of places. And here you can see Sani Orfa, Edessa. It'll just click you and bring you right there. So this is a wonderful tool for those of you who teach, as I do. Because of course students today are very visual, and if you put something up on the board, suddenly they're going to watch, you know. So being able to see that these places that we talk about in our theology, in our text, are actual real places with material culture can be very effective, I think. And so that was the idea. And then I put together, with the help of my team, the portal on saints, the Kadishe, as well as hagiography. So this is a portal of hagiographic text, so hagiography being the genre of the Syriac saints, of saints' lives. I keep wondering why this is moving so slow. I have to be patient. There it goes.
Probably because of the internet.
There we go. And this, actually, the data that we had for this project was inherited from two scholars, Father Hugo Zanetti and his student, Dr. Claude Detienne, had started the work and did a lot of the research, and then they genuinely passed it on to us. So it was one of the neat things about digital projects is that they are always collaborative, and you are all in it together to make information more available about these different topics. So that's just a little bit of an introduction to that project. And later on, if you want, we can talk more about that and some other news about where we're going, because there's actually more goodies coming along in Syriaca that we're working on. Okay. That being said, now that that was all very modern, we're going to go back to the beginning of time with the creation of the world. Okay. Now, I got to find my presentation. Where is it? That's not right. Can you help me, please? Thank you. Oh, this one? Is that it? Okay. Okay. Yep, that's good. Okay, thank you. All right. So as some of you might know, or many of you here probably know at least, in 2015, our Pope Francis published an encyclical called Laudato Si on care for our common home, on care for our planet, on care for ecology. And of course, he articulated in this encyclical that this concept of integral ecology, that care for our planet is also about care for everyone, because damage to the planet and the environment hurts people, especially the poor, most. That is to say, it's all linked together. And he grounded his theology in some very key passages in Scripture, in the book of Genesis, in our understanding of creation and humanity's place as stewards of God's creation. And this was really a sort of important step in Catholic theology when care for the environment became officially part of church teaching. But it occurred to me that there was so many echoes of what he was articulating in things that I had read in the Syriac Fathers, who are profoundly, who seem to have a profoundly rich theology of creation and of indeed human responsibility as far as what we are called to be, that I thought it would be an interesting place to consider how these two can be linked in a sort of helpful way, rather than thinking, of sort of modern Roman Catholic theology and ancient Syriac theology. It's all part of one tradition. We are all part of one tradition. We can draw from the resources of one another as we consider this. Okay, so it begins, of course, with an understanding. We're going to think about a little bit all the way back to the story of Genesis, which is for theologians, both ancient and modern, always there's so much that's contained in the two accounts of the creation of the world. So much about what it means to be a human person, what our relationship with God could have been, what it was at one time, what it became, and all of those things. There's so much contained that it's a good place to start. As you know, in the stories, in the accounts of creation, we read that God creates humanity in his own image, in the image and likeness of God. And so there are different interpretations that we're gonna consider about what that meant to be in the image and likeness of God. The image of God and then the likeness of God. As you know, before Adam and Eve disobey God, because of course it's worth remembering, God could have created humanity however God wanted, right? He's God. God is God. But God chooses to create humanity with free will. And what do? God gives us all these wonderful things in the story of creation. In Eden, we have an idyllic relationship with God. We don't have to work. There's no pain. Everything is peaceful. There's tranquility. There's goodness. There's only one thing we're not supposed to do, and that's to eat from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And poor Eve, she gets tricked. She gets tricked by the serpent. And the serpent takes God's words and twists them around, saying, did God really tell you that you would die? Are you sure? And so he starts to play with her and tease her, and then he tricks her. She sees that the fruit was good to eat, and she eats. Am I walking out of the pic? I'm not used to being filmed. I tend to, like my father, I tend to go all over the place. So this is very, I'm sorry if I walk over here. Anyway, sorry, I forgot that I was on camera. She's good to eat. And what does she do? She eats it. And after that, everything changes. So in that act of disobedience, you have the introduction then of fear, of discord. I mean, you think about it, Adam and Eve were fine. As soon as she disobeys, and then of course she gives it to Adam and he disobeys, and before they were loving, and then as soon as this happens, Adam says, it was that woman, she was the one. You know, all of a sudden there's blame. All of a sudden there's discord, there's pain, there's work. Now Adam has to work. Now Eve will suffer the pains of childbirth, all of these things. And so the story, and then they get cast out of Eden. And so the story of creation always has this melancholic tragedy of what we once were, what God wanted for us, and then what happened. Now, of course, as Christians, we believe that this gets restored with the coming of the Word made flesh, with the birth of Jesus. So Christ comes to undo the sins of his first parents. And I love these icons that come here of Christ lifting Adam and Eve up. Look at how hopeful everyone is. He breaks the bonds. He undoes the bad choices that Adam and Eve made with their free will through his love and through his gifts to restore right relationship between humanity and God. And again, creation is at the center of this. Genesis 1, the first creation story, has a beautiful articulation or presentation of how God forms the world like a divine craftsman, picturing the world. Let there be light. Let there be a sun and the moon. And it's important to see too, of course, in the story of Genesis 1, what God does when it's all over. He rests, right? So then the creation of the Sabbath, so important, the creation of time here, giving us then as humanity the background for our own liturgical calendar, which will be as a result from these creations of day and night. And most importantly, it says in Genesis that creation was not just good, it was very good. It was wonderful. And the goodness of creation will be solidified again and ratified in a way immeasurably hard, impossible to understand through the incarnation. Creation is so good that God himself becomes flesh, comes into the world, sanctifying creation. And you see too here how because of that reality, all of creation can now reflect something of God. Humanity most of all. We are the image and likeness of God, but not just humanity. All things can teach us something about the nature of God because they come from God. And today in this beautiful day of Washington, it's so easy to understand that. Just walking around and seeing everything is in bloom. Everything is in bloom. Everything has come back to life, teaching us that this constant cycle that we live in of death and rebirth is reflected even in our own creation. And God is a part of it. Humanity is a part of it, reminding us too that God delights in his creation. This is all the backdrop here for what becomes such a rich theology in the early church of the created world and the cosmos, as well as human responsibility. I don't have that. Oh, okay. I'm just going to keep track of the clock. And so there are so many images then of God as our divine craftsman, the divine craftsman. And so God has this authority as creator that he will allow humanity to share in as stewards of his creation. He is bringing all these different things to life, the entire cosmos and the various beings to life by his simple commands. Let them be, and so on and so forth. And as I said, included in this is the creation of the Sabbath. I always like to remind my students this: if you like your weekend, remember that too comes from God. Resting, so important, that God delights and takes a break. So the Lord then fashions humanity as a potter working with clay. But we're reminded in the story of Adam and Eve, again, this sadness. We were almost immortal. We could have had that, but then we lost it because of the trick of the serpent. And after that, there's an inversion of relationships now. There's previously man and God worked together in the garden, but now man becomes afraid of God. Remember, Adam hides from the voice of God. So again, this fear instead of love. Previously, man delights in woman as bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. After, he says, that woman you gave, points a finger at her. So you have this disillusionment here in the story of Adam and Eve. And this core issue of the problem of the alienation that was caused between humanity's disobedience with God. And because of that disobedience also comes doubt and distrust in God. We don't see God for what God truly is. And this whole story then can give us an understanding of sin, yes, but for our purposes today too, of how humanity will always then not quite understand what creation is, right? And we're going to get ourselves into a terrible situation with the world, this created, beautiful world, because we don't quite understand what our own responsibilities are. So here's where you can start to reflect on, I think, this contemporary ecological crisis that we have in the world is perhaps a result of human sin. And this is what Pope Francis is going to say. We have to sort of acknowledge this to start to understand, to resurrect what the voice of the biblical theology and ancient Christian theology can give us in terms of seeing things for what they truly are. It doesn't have to end there. It doesn't have to be depressing, but we have to acknowledge that past before we can move forward. So certainly here, when we think about, the ancient fathers didn't have ecological crisis, environmental crisis in the world. It was a very different world that they lived in. They had other problems, certainly, that were real. But we do have this problem, and as Pope Francis had said, we have to acknowledge, unfortunately, that the damage that we've done to our environment is hurting those vulnerable, especially, most of all. And those of us who have been to developing nations can see that, right? The flooding, the damage to the crops, the lack of good water, the lack of people having basic needs. This is coming from sin, and that's hard. But again, it's a misunderstanding of what we were supposed to do as stewards with God's creation. So I think it's really interesting then to look back on what the Bible actually says about ruling over other creatures. What does that really mean? And what does free will really mean in earlier contexts, specifically the Syriac Fathers? This is a really interesting icon that I came across It's a modern icon about Christ freeing cruelty to animals, which I thought was really beautiful and appropriate for today's topic. This dog in the corner is really lovely. I'm a dog lover. I know the world's divided into cat and dog lovers, so I wouldn't have put an icon up with a cat. No, just kidding. Anyway, so this contempt, but the idea that because actually this is what this is reminding us of is a theme that we'll go back to. Of course, Pope Francis takes his patronage from St. Francis of Assisi, who's known as a great saint of the environment. The saints, holy men and women of God, through their life, through their sacrifice, through their discipleship, recapture the innocence of Adam and Eve before the fall. And part of that innocence was that men and women lived peacefully with the animals. They lived peacefully with the animals. And we're going to see that theology come up over and over again. So back to the Bible then. What does it mean that God let humanity have this special authority or rule over creation? After all other creatures, and I have to give credit here, much of my thinking as far as the Syriac tradition has and ecology goes has come from a wonderful article that I can commend to you by the late Father Robert Murray, published 1999, Hugoye, on Syriac Fathers, ecology, and human responsibility. It had some wonderful, very helpful for me in preparing this presentation. So after all other creatures have been brought into existence, God says, "Let us create humankind in our image and likeness, and let them rule over other creatures." There it is. But what does this mean? And then it goes on, then God blessed them and told them to multiply and fill the earth, to subdue it and rule over other creatures. So it's quite clear that God gives humanity a special authority. A special authority. But what the fathers didn't quite agree on, East and West, Latin speaking like Augustine and Greek speaking like Syriac speaking like Ephraim, was what does this likeness of God mean? What does it mean to be in the likeness of God? Are these spiritual qualities? Are these intellectual qualities? Can we make these distinctions? And that led to some different understanding, because for the Western understanding, it really, Augustine himself focused on this authority, on this rule, on the superiority of humanity because of our intellect. And that sort of led to a different understanding of our position in creation. However, in the East, the likeness of God was much more about free will. So we are created with free will, and Christ comes to restore us to the divinity to which we were created. And so this is what it means to be in the image of God. We have this free will, this special authority. But with this authority comes responsibility. And here's where they can be so interesting, and there can be so many echoes, I think, with modern theologies of the environment and environmental responsibility. So the Syrian Fathers, beginning with the Antiochian traditions, pictures the human race as standing, Murray calls it, in the position of God's viceroys. So this special authority that we have, endowed by God, but also answerable to God. Because we have this free will, this authority over other creatures, we are also answerable to how we treat them. So it's that responsibility, I think, which needs to be recalled when we think about our position in the world and our position over creatures. So free will is how we are in the likeness of God. So Genesis presents God as supremely wise and powerful, like a good king. And God entrusts this world to us, the race of creatures. We are to act as God's representatives in the world. What a fascinating, revolutionary way to think of our place in the world. All humanity is acting as a representative of God. But that's a different idea, because it's the responsibility and the representation that is connected with someone who loves the things over which you are entrusted, like a family model almost, you might say. It's not one of domination in the same way. It's not one of neglect. Perhaps that's the most important thing. You don't neglect the things that have been entrusted to you. So I think, again, this is a very useful bridge point here with what Pope Francis will talk about in his encyclical Laudato Si. So St. Ephrem, who's, as you all know, such a wonderful saint of the Syriac tradition, and I apologize, Father Joe would hate this picture of St. Ephrem, as many of you know, because Father Joe Era, because it's showing him in the garb of a monk. He wasn't a monk, we all know this, so I acknowledge it's problematic, right? But Ephrem has a wonderful section here on his prose commentary on Genesis that elaborates on this concept of free will and human responsibility. And this is a translation from Robert Murray. And God said, this is Ephrem's word, "Let us make man in our image." That is to say, endowed with authority, shalit in Syriac, to the point that if it seems good to him, and nesh parle, he will obey us. So that obedience comes from sort of respect, right? The animals respect you if they see that you're a good ruler. I'm thinking about my dog right now, who respects me if I feed it. But anyway, now what that means is that we are in the image of God has been explained by Moses, Ephrem says, where he says, "And let them have authority, neshtun, over the fish of the sea and of the birds, the cattle and all the earth." This is the authority that Adam received, shulpana, over the earth and all that is in it, that the likeness, demutha, to God consists to him who has authority over things above and below. So our likeness to God is connected then to that authority that God has given us. And the animals respond because they see that God's reflection within how we act. In the same way, Jacob of Suruj, another great Syriac father from the 6th century, talks about sultana, authority, and which Murray shows in his article can often be translated into English also as free will. It's a word which we don't have a good equivalence to in the English language. It's authority, but it's also free will, kind of like the Greek word exousia in the New Testament. So Jacob says in his homily on the 6th day of creation, as soon as the cosmos saw him, it wholly submitted to him. Every kind of cattle, even wild animals, drew near to him in reverence, and he sealed them as his own. What a beautiful image of the animals and Adam working together. And this is he then elaborates on how Adam names the animals. He called out names. So that authority to name the animals, this special divine, this special gift, this special free will that comes with responsibility that Adam has. So, and by the names, he subjected them to make them his own, for the Lord had granted him to possess them. It was right, too, since he was the image of God. Sure. For him to lay his hand on everything that the Lord, his Lord, had made. Now, he couldn't create, but he gave names, and he became a partner in God's work of creation. he became a partner in God's work of creation. Now, I don't know, we should call Pope Francis up and get his opinion. I don't want to speak for him, right? Someone, maybe he can bring him in on FaceTime. But I think he would say that this is exactly what he's trying to articulate, that we are partners in the work of creation, protecting creation here. And even Edmund Beck said that this theology of the Syrian Fathers, when it comes to ecology, seems, as he put it, surprisingly modern. That's not the German, of course. In Ephraim's Hymns on Paradise, he says, before Adam and Eve's disobedience, all creatures and elements live in harmony. It's a cosmic, moral, and social harmony. So it's the created world, it's how they're treating each other, and it's the society that they've built with one another. So Ephraim says, he brought them to Adam to indicate his wisdom and the peaceful state which existed between the animals and Adam prior to transgressing the commandment. Now again, we're going to look at some pictures of St. Francis of Assisi too. St. Francis could speak to animals. St. Francis could communicate to animals because he had that power to have that innocence before the fall. And Ephraim says, this is so beautiful, for they came to him as a loving shepherd, passing in front of him without any fear, flock after flock, according to their species and varieties. They had no fear of him. Fear is always an indication of the absence of love. The two can never coexist, right? It's always a sign of sin, of a break, of sadness. A herd of predators passed by, followed fearlessly by the animals upon which they preyed. So this image of harmony that Ephraim imagines, compared to then the creation of thorns. So Ephraim is always taking his cues in his theology from nature and scripture, as Murray himself and Brock have shown over and over again. And here he's thinking about thorns. The thorn, the very existence of a thorn is a sign of a rupture. Something went wrong. Somehow the thorn doesn't belong. And this thorn that you see is a sign, a sign of that. So he says, excuse me, against the heresies, the thorn, the sprouting of a thorn testified to a novel sprouting of wrong actions. So thorns are creation, thorns themselves exist. He says, thorns did not sprout as long as wrongdoing had not yet happened. But once they peered out, hidden from wrong choices made by free will. So when we misused our free will, the thorns themselves reflected that. This beautiful rose has now been tarnished with this kind of painful reality. The visible thorns peering out from the earth. So the thorn itself is a symbol of the abuse of free will in creation. Isn't that powerful? I mean, this is the kind of thing that I love to teach my students, my undergrads, who sometimes will say very casually, it doesn't really matter if you believe in God. Religion doesn't really matter. You can still be a good person and not have all these things. And I want to say, wait a second. Your faith is all about how you see the world. Of course you can be a good person and not believe in God. Of course. But it's a way of viewing everything that changes. And this is exactly what I mean. You can see something in a very different way when we see it through the eyes of faith, in a kind of cosmic dimension. And the Syrians are so good at teaching this, I think. How am I doing on time? Oh, we're doing fine. Okay. So I'm going to just take a drink of water for a second. 1 second. Hope I'm not shouting at you.
No?
It's okay?
Yep.
And we will have time, by the way, for conversation. I'm not just going to talk. So far, so good? Are you with me?
Yes.
All right, okay. Moving to the Western tradition now as we make our way into the modern period. I always, again, like to tell my students, I think most things interesting in the history of the church happened before 700, but if we must go further, then let's go to the medieval period. St. Francis, one of my great heroes, he's certainly one of the most popular saints in the Catholic tradition. But why? What is it about St. Francis that has always made him so compelling as a person? He casts everything off to follow Jesus. His name, his wealth, the life that his parents wanted for him, and he chooses to live as a beggar. He chooses to live simply in poverty, and tries through that life to live a life of compunction, to live a life of compassion. And the outpouring of that compassion is reflected in stories that were told about St. Francis and his compassion, not just for other people, but indeed for animals as well. He reaches out to, like Jesus himself, he reaches out to the outcast. He kissed a leper, heals him body and soul. He tames the birds and he calls them sisters. So in the flowers of St. Francis, "Oh, my sisters, simple and innocent, chaste turtle doves, why do you let yourself be taken?" He makes a nest and they hatch young chicks. And so there's this, I mean, it's a sweetness and it's a foolishness too, isn't it? You sort of, what would we think if we actually saw a man talking to the birds? You know, it's an interesting question. If we saw somebody, right, if we saw that, how are we ourselves kind of sort of imprisoned by our own judgments about what holiness is? But certainly, in the story of St. Francis, it seems to channel again this innocence, this special gift or charisma of compassion and speaking to the animals. In this very famous story, the conversion of the wolf. You guys know, some of you know this story. Yeah, there was a wolf that was torturing the people of Gubbio, thank you. And he says, "Come hither, Friar Wolf." So notice how he addressed him as a friar. One of his own, right? He is a peer, a colleague. And that solidarity transforms the wolf. And so I think here it's like a symbol. This can be extracted to human relationships as well. When we look at people as one-to-one rather than as above or below, that's where the transformation takes place. He sees the possibility for the wolf to have compassion, you might say. "I command you in Christ's name that you do no harm to me or no other." And then he knows his fierceness was from hunger. "I understand. You're just hungry." And again, this you could see how his starting point is compassion even on this animal. Rather than, what is our natural reaction when we see a wolf? Fear, right? And so Francis is love and the challenge of that love. So in a sense, again, it's this concept of trying to love those who are hardest to love, whether it be the leper or a wolf, but the transformative power of that compassion. And preaching to the birds, another beautiful story of Francis of Assisi. He doesn't just pray, he preaches. There Francis began to preach, but first he bade the swallows that were twittering to keep silent. Shh, I'm talking, And they obeyed him. "My sisters, the birds, you are much obliged to God, your creator." So again, speaking to the animals as part of creation. He's showing he has authority, isn't he? I need to talk. You can't talk. Humanity can talk. We have that gift from God, to this gift of speech and articulation. You can sing, Let me talk. Thank you. But I'm not going to shoot you down, right? And so it's not a surprise then that this is the inspiration of our Pope's encyclical Laudato Si. I mean, he names himself for Pope Francis in the spirit of Francis of Assisi. And then our Pope comes out with this encyclical again on care for our common home. We'll just sort of end the next 5 to 10 minutes with a couple of closing thoughts about what he said. And then perhaps we can have a conversation about things that struck you in our conversation and things that you would like to add, because I want to learn from you as well. Does that sound good? Okay, good. If we approach nature and the environment without openness to awe and wonder, Francis says, if we no longer speak of the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. So I thought it was striking that his beginning point here in the encyclical is change the position. We must change the position that we have. We have to see the world through the eyes of awe and wonder. That is all over the theology of the Syriac Fathers. I think of, for instance, St. Ephrem speaks of the wonder that Mary, the Mother of God, has holding her newborn child. The wonder, the awe that she could give birth to the Son of God and what that must have felt like. Wonder and awe. And so here, a bridge between the two theologies. And so then the care will come up spontaneously if we consider that this is our common home. Our common home, we have this responsibility to use our free will to protect. Then he gets very frank about the situation of our world, about what our the brothers and sisters who work in the natural sciences are warning us, have told us. Pollution and climate change, the access to water, which is causing so much injustice in the world. The loss of biodiversity too, the loss of the diversity that God has created, and then how that actually hurts human life. This is so obvious. You know, it's so hard if kids don't have parks to play in, right? Where do they play? What about kids who never see what a tree is because they are locked in a urban jungle? And this is all connected to global inequality. So he says, the climate is a common good belonging and meant for all. So we don't, it's, as I mentioned before, it's important to note that the Syrian Fathers or the patristic authors didn't have ecological crisis like we have today. But we do, so we need to bring their voice to bear on our issues today. And again, see how human activity, unfortunately, we are all responsible, and we are therefore called to do something, even if it's something small. I had the privilege as a high school kid of meeting Jane Goodall once, a great environmentalist, and she reiterated to me just how you can never underestimate the impact that one person can have. It sounds sort of like a cliche, but it's absolutely true. Now, the Pope also emphasizes how the climate change and its effects are hurting the poor the most. They are hurting developing countries the most. Climate change is a global problem, he says, with grave implications: environmental, social, economic, and political. And it's disproportionately harming the vulnerable. This isn't something that first world countries see as evidently or as obviously, but it certainly is present in other parts of the world. And then he says in he has a chapter called The Gospel of Creation, reminding us again, and this is bring us back to the beginning. God creates everything with goodness. And we have a special privilege. We are uniquely called to exercise, he puts it, responsible stewardship over creation. And he also, again, brings it back. And this is where I think, the Pope kind of oscillates between speaking as a scientist and speaking as a theologian so beautifully in this encyclical. Because then he says, but let's not forget, creation is a mystery reflecting the goodness of God, the diversity and the unity of which reflect and mediate the Creator. So creation is teaching us always something about God. And so if we're destroying that, what does that say about our respect for the Creator if we are destroying creation? And so he calls us to reflect on how sin, how environmental harm is a result of sin. So, and he reiterates that dominion is a call for responsibility. He brings to bear, he coins a really important phrase called integral ecology in this encyclical as well. And he calls attention to the problem of an anthropocentrism, devaluing creation and leading to a relativism. In other words, we only use creation if it's helpful to humanity, not considering its own integral goodness. And then finally, though, he does end with the sacraments. And this is, I think, this is a really beautiful way to bring the whole thing back. The sacraments, which are God's gift to us so that God can bring us into relationship, so that we can become more like God, the sacraments use creation. They use created matter, right? The bread and the wine and the water. That all comes from creation. So every time we are given the sacraments, we are able to receive the sacraments that bring us back, that restore our relationship with God and one another too. We are also involving ourselves in the beauty of creation. We can't forget that. And in the liturgy as well, most of all, the beauty of the liturgy too, reflecting God's goodness in showing what we are when we are at our best. And we are always at our best when we're worshiping God. And I think that worship looks even more beautiful when it's put into the context of an understanding of creation as teaching us something about the wonderful Creator who made it. Thank you. We're all colleagues here, and if there's someone that wants to offer a suggestion too, or an insight, please feel free. I don't have all the answers. I don't have most of the answers. I might be able to answer one or two things. We can rely on the shared experience and understanding, that we've had. Yes, please, Bishop.
Can you share with us the reference from Father
Murray?
Father Murray? Yes.
Yes.
I don't have it on me, but I can email it to you.
Yes.
And so I can send you the whole article, actually.
That would be even better.
Yeah, it's a wonderful article. And as I said, he actually wrote a whole book on this topic, it turned out. And this article was a sort of condensed version of the main points of his. And there's a lot of other references to Narsi and further references. I think you would really enjoy it. And I was really grateful to find it. Yeah. Yes.
I appreciate the insight into man, meaning man and woman, authority over creation as a responsibility, as a moral responsibility, just like God gave that to them, not as a domination, but as a responsibility. That was a good insight.
I found it very, very helpful. It changes everything, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
I was going to kind of point out the same thing. It amazed me, though, with the idea about the naming of the creatures, which I always realized, but the way you presented it, or I guess maybe presenting Ephraim's view of it, or the whole idea too in the Semitic world about to know someone's name, like they won't pronounce God's name because it's to know a name means you have power, some kind of power or authority over them. You know something intimately about them. So for Adam to have named the creatures was God giving him that power over them.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's dominion but not domination.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you can elaborate more on this whole naming part.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I'll tell you, it's something that Christian interpreters as well as rabbinic interpreters have a lot to say on, and as you pointed out, and as I was preparing this, I learned too there's a rich iconographic tradition about this scene. So if you were to look up images of Adam naming the animals, you would find lots of things. It was something that people have found very compelling. And also, it precedes the creation of Eve, right? That's an important piece. So he's naming all these animals, but none of them are a suitable helpmate.
He doesn't name though Eve.
Oh no,
right?
He doesn't. Right? They put it right.
God
names Eve, and but there's this idea that Adam is also trying to be friends with these animals, and it's not quite working out.
Yeah.
You know.
Not my type.
Yeah. Right.
No, I think he said,
Yes, please.
doesn't he say, I shall call her Eve because she is bone?
Yeah.
Flesh of my flesh and bone.
This one is now.
But he doesn't name her Eve, does he?
We got to get the Bible
I
out.
think he did.
Someone here have a Bible?
Because that changes the whole perspective.
Genesis 2.
Does he have dominion over it?
Call a woman.
Genesis 2 stories of
Adam was the
creation.
one that named
You
her.
know, one makes a human being on the 6th day, which means it's like pyramid. And the second one,
Yeah,
in the first one, he doesn't name.
No, it's
the
in the
creature.
it's in the second,
In the second
account.
story,
It's in
to make
chapter
sure-
2. Yeah.
And both of them, in first one, human being at the pyramid at the top, and God definitely. And the second one, human being in the center of the circle, and he is in charge of creation. But I love the idea of accountability. You know, yes, we are masters, but we're accountable to God. It's dominion, not domination. But you know, I'll see Genesis.
Yeah. On the topic of the naming, it's so funny because our gospel yesterday was when Mary didn't recognize Jesus until he said her name. And we talked about that a lot, about
Yes.
how that name, it's personal now. You know, and then she recognized him the minute he said her name. And he didn't say, hi, you know, Mary, it's me, Jesus. He
Right.
just said Mary, and then
Right.
she knew him. And I think that relationship with Adam and the animals and naming them, it makes that a real relationship.
Yes.
So that
Yes,
that
thank you.
struck me.
Yeah.
I came across a thought or a statement from the patristic fathers referring to the killing or the sacrificing of animals as a result of sin. Because God in the creation in Genesis, he refers to the plants and the seeds as food. So I was wondering if you came across something like in your research that, you know.
Yes. That's primordial. They call it primordial vegetarianism.
Yeah.
That
read
was
that, yeah.
before before sin. People didn't eat the animals. That's one of the reasons why monastic diets often were vegetarian. This idea, the monastic life. We'll be talking about this later when we talk about saints. But the ascetic life was geared to living out in a real way life before the fall. What does that look like if you could get there? And so part of that is not eating meat, because that indicates killing and, you know, sort of not, you don't eat your colleagues, right? Well, we're not going to talk about that.
But then in the New Testament, you know, in the Acts of the Apostle, when Peter sees the table, God says, you know, everything is permissible, right?
Right.
So how do you reconcile these two?
Yeah, that's a good. Are you thinking of the Jewish dietary laws, right? Yeah, that's a good question. Yes.
Genesis 2 said, the Lord God then built the rib he had taken from the man into woman. When he brought her to the man said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman. For out of man this one has been taken.
Right, but I also went to chapter 3, and it says that later on, like I think verse 20 in chapter 3, it says Adam called her Eve.
Which means
That's where but prior to that, it's woman, 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 woman. Even with the serpent, he said to the woman.
The woman that you gave me.
I would like, I'm interested to see sometimes how creation, Mother Nature, slaps human being. And that's why all what we call the national disasters happen. Yes, in some way, nature corrects the mistakes of the man, the woman, you know, I'm talking humanity.
Right.
And that perspective, and that maybe we should kind of little bit search to see what's the cause. Yes, we're harming, but Mother Nature has a way to get back to us.
It's very
one way or
interesting.
another.
Right, and
I'm
Ephraim.
talking about the volcanoes. I'm talking about the earthquakes. I'm talking about, you know, the hurricanes. You name it. All those phenomena, the fires. The Mother Nature at the end is part of regeneration and recorrecting the cosmos in some way or another.
And the earth, throughout Scripture, the earth does respond when grave injustices happen, like the crucifixion. The earth quakes.
Right.
You know, and so there is this participation, there's a response, right? Yeah.
You know, I was just thinking again about this naming. It's interesting though that the naming of Eve by Adam takes place after the fall. So is he like maybe abusing his authority?
Interesting, right?
Lots to think about.
Yeah, it is. He just says this flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. He says this woman, but it's not until chapter 3, I think it's verse 20. It says, and Adam. It's after the fall, after the serpent and Eve have their little discussion. That it says, this woman that you gave me, and then it says, and he called her Eve. Because she's the mother of the living.
Yeah.
It was in the evening, maybe.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. What did he
And,
Not only the fall, but it was evening time.
and it's a good right. It's a good point too to consider, since we're talking about Eve. Yes.
But we need to understand the meaning of Eve. You know, he's describing what's her function is bringing life. You know, too. It's not just a name; it was a meaning for it.
Yeah, but
Adam coming out of the earth, and here Eve giving life.
But it's going to be giving life in pain now because of the fall.
This is not because of Adam. It's not. He's telling us this is because of Christ said. You know, it's not. You know, it's, God said it. You'll be from now. But the whole idea of Eve, the word means this one gives life, and I think it was not for me in the meaning way. He was giving her in some way. This is the reality. She's the one who generates life.
No, I understand. I'm just trying to elaborate maybe on the idea that if truly the naming has authority, then what are we saying when Adam names Eve? Does he have authority over her? Dominion over her?
No, responsibility.
I think here he meant.
Is he abusing that because now after the fall, it's not in the proper relationship that it should have
No, I
been?
think because he said over there woman in the first one, and now he's
That was
saying given.
He
In the
calls her
second
woman
chapter,
before the fall.
Yeah, but think about it. Now he's describing her main. She will be giving life.
We need to
That
look at
woman,
Ephraim.
in some way, I don't see it as the meaning.
I might
as
say
much as,
it's interesting, not to take away from your conversation here, but it's interesting at this point too, perhaps to consider to recall that Mary is going to become
The
the
woman.
new Eve.
Yeah.
And what does she do with her free will? She says yes. And so it's always important, I think, she is going to figure into is the mother of the new creation, because from her, because of her because of the way, the brave, the courageous yes that she makes with her free will, the restoration happens. So this is also richly elaborated in by the Syriac Fathers.
Let's take one question more, and then we have to prepare for lunch.
Oh, okay.
Just one thought. Because you associated authority with responsibility, I was wondering if you came across where Adam blamed Eve already came from the lack of the responsibility that he should have been protecting her rather than being tricked by her. So there is also like
there's a tension there.
There's a tension even before, in his thought process, even before the act took place or being tricked, that he fell on his responsibilities. I was wondering if you came across anything like that.
I've mostly seen, just as I said, in general, that there's a presentation of harmony between the two people, and in a sense, God, like true godliness, peace and love, and then they disobey, and then immediately after he's blaming her. Yeah. And so there you have it. So, but then it makes you think every time then that we do something similar, we're modeling them. Every time we blame someone else rather than take responsibility. But yeah, I've never, and actually, as people have noted, there's so many different ways that ancient readers of that story interpreted whose fault was it really? Was it Eve's fault? Was it Adam's fault? Was it the serpent's fault? We really want to know.
We want both.
We're obsessed with this
all of
one.
the above.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that simple.
But the best thing about it is a teaching story. It's
Right.
not a reality. It's not real.
Yeah, it
It's
is.
not the way it happened. Like
And,
this.
and the very fact that we can still get excited about it,
You
right?
have to keep that in mind. You have to keep that in mind.
You're saying it
Thank
didn't
you,
happen?
everybody.